Because each of you has fairly extensive biographical material of each of the speakers today in your binders, in your folders, I'm not going to go into too much detail. However, these two speakers are so exceptional that I want to just give you a paragraph on each. The Honorable Judith S. Kaye is currently of counsel at Skadden Arps. She's to my right. However, she served as Chief Judge of the New York Court of Appeals for 15 years, longer than any Chief Judge in New York's history. She was also the first woman to serve on New York's highest court. She has received numerous awards for her extraordinary work at the bench, including the ABA's John Marshall Award, the National Center for State Courts William Rehnquist Award for Judicial Excellence, and the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services Adoption Excellence Award. Today she's going to be talking on learning from the past and looking to the future. Please welcome Judith Kaye.
Thank you so much, Dean Anderson, Dr. Lenzer. Thank you for this absolutely wonderful program. I do agree, I'll use a word from my own life. I affirm all of the praise and compliments for the morning. I have to tell you, I have enlarged my brain this morning. I have enlarged my vocabulary. Can't wait to get back to Skadden Arps and start talking about epigenics. And I have enlarged my jewelry collection. You all have this wonderful bracelet, right? I want to tell you that I am by nature a prepared text speaker. And from the 19th century, there'll be no PowerPoints or wonderful videos for you to see. And actually, I just revise my remarks 1,000 times over. It's like I'm working on an opinion for the Court of Appeals of the State of New York, and it was my privilege to do that actually for more than 25 years. But I want to tell you that today I had a special challenge finding where to start. And I just want to give you an example of my angst. Now, the subject of the day is social justice for children. So I began formulating my remarks around the most welcome October 13th announcement of the Attorney General's Task Force on Children Exposed to Violence. That's a critical part of Attorney General Holder's Defending Child Initiative that was introduced last year. And what a great idea, don't you think so? And what a great launching point, a great starting point for me in my remarks, as it is for this program. I love the quote, "Our vision of justice must start with preventing crime before it happens," and we just heard James Mercy echo that in his remarks as well. Every young person deserves the opportunity to grow up and develop free from fear of violence. Memorable words of Associate Attorney General Tom Perelli. So I decided I would start right there. But then, like minutes later, I was captivated by a New York Times editorial focused on the latest statistics in America's prisons. To use their words, the Times words, notoriously inefficient and only minimally effective, often creating hardened criminals out of first-time offenders. We all know that so well, don't we? Unbelievable, utterly unbelievable. Imagine we have 5% of the world's population, and we have 25% of the world's prisoners. We lock up more young people than any nation in the entire world. Is this America, I ask you? And as you know, nobody goes to court voluntarily. Nobody goes to court voluntarily, few people do. Nobody goes to prison voluntarily. It takes the courts to put them there. Is this American justice? A perfect subject to kick off the program and the part on courts and the judiciary, which is the part we are turned to now. So I decided this is where I'll start my remarks. We know the face of the prison population. They're the same kids we're talking about in the last panel, are they not? We've established beyond all doubt that abused and neglected children are more likely than their peers to engage in delinquent and criminal acts as they grow up. It's that cycle of violence and victimization that we've been talking about. And we do have incredibly good data on our prison population. We know the racial and ethnic disproportion. We know the sad, impoverished, violent childhood so many of these people have had. And we even have a name for this phenomenon. We call it the cradle to prison pipeline. Yeah, I'm going to start my remarks right there. But then, wouldn't you know, days later, came a headline, again in the New York Times, reporting on an increase in school suspensions in New York City, and that totally took over my attention. So you see the problem I've been having in getting off the ground. It turns out that in one school in East Harlem, New York, can you imagine this? There were more school suspensions than there were students in the entire school. And we have a name for that too. We're very good at putting names to things. We call it the school to prison pipeline. And there too, we have exquisitely detailed data on the relationship between school discipline, suspensions, expulsions, dropouts, and incarceration, again, with the courts right at the center, because you don't go to prison without the intervention of the courts. Now, I was blown away, I don't know how many of the rest of you were, by the Texas data. Patricia, you too? Released within the past couple of months. Breaking Schools Rules, a statewide study of how school discipline relates to student success in juvenile justice environment. That's what it's called, and I imagine many of you are familiar with it. Can you imagine, in the state of Texas, with the second largest public school in the nation, I wonder if we're the first, or California's the first. If we're not the first, we're the third in New York. Individual school records for every single 7th grade public school student in the years 2000, 2001, and 2002 were studied over a 6-year period and more, enhanced by juvenile justice records. There were a breathtaking million or more data points about adolescence. And does it surprise you to know that students involved in the school disciplinary system in Texas averaged 8 suspensions and/or expulsions during their high school years? Does it surprise you that African American male students had the highest rate of discretionary violations? Does it surprise you that students suspended or expelled were found to have repeated their grade at least once, or that more than 1 in 7 of the students was in contact with the juvenile justice system? I don't need to go on. You get the drift, don't you? And for me, at this particular moment in my life, I call this my afterlife, my chief judge afterlife. The Texas data has enormous resonance. I look at it every single day, because here in New York, I am in a leadership group planning a nationwide summit, which is scheduled for March 11 to 13 in New York City, called Promoting School Justice Partnerships, Keeping Kids in School and Out of Courts. Now, courts are just not good places for kids to grow up in, and regrettably, many, many people do grow up in the courts from birth to death. Neither are the New York's out-of-placement facilities, a good many of which were condemned by the United States Department of Justice and closed. Kids deserve the opportunity to grow up in their own homes and their families, their schools and communities with love and stability, free of fear and violence. So I could start there. I could start with a focus on zero tolerance, expulsive school discipline policies, which have become so familiar throughout the nation during the past decade. And I was pleased to read in the annual report of the Special Representative of the United Nations Secretary General on Violence Against Children, a recognition of the unique potential of education to create a positive environment in which attitudes condoning violence can be changed and nonviolent behavior can be learned, a potential today that stands in total, complete, and absolute contrast to the daily reality for millions upon millions of our children exposed to intimidation and gang violence and assault. So now you see how challenging these weeks have been for me, as the news every single day has changed the starting point of my remarks. I have to tell you, I thought I was all ready to come yesterday when I received news of the world premiere of a documentary film that will show next Thursday. I mean, this is like assault on my writing ability, don't you think so? Next Thursday, November 10, at the National Press Club in Washington, D.C., called Young Kids, Hard Time. And it's like the Texas study in that it follows youngsters, it actually follows youngsters who are serving decades behind bars in a maximum security prison. So maybe I should start with that, raising the age of criminal responsibility. Then I studied your program. It's, by the way, just a totally fabulous program. And I noticed this afternoon that you have Michael Corriero among others. So I know that the subject is very comfortably covered in the hands of Judge Corriero and the others. So every single one of these issues, of course, involves courts and judges, which is the subject that we're on now, whether child abuse or foster care or custody or termination of parental rights or juvenile delinquency or the like. In New York State Family Court, now you have to absorb this statistic, last year alone, there were more than 720,000 new filings. Now that involves several million appearances of people in the courts. Yes, and that's just the state of New York. Courts and the judiciary indeed are heavily involved in the subject of social justice for children. But as I anguished over precisely where I would begin my remarks this morning, an immensely positive message of my dilemma broke through the clouds. As day to day, the news changed and my attention changed, the center of my attention changed. And it occurred to me that it is so important and so exciting that at long last, like never ever before in my life, social justice for children, treating children as children, these are the issues every single day, seizing public attention, commanding the headlines that I've told you about just in my own experience these past weeks, inspiring task forces and documentaries, collaborations, and national consultations like this one. Because the fact is that it has become intolerable. We can no longer continue to ignore these statistics. Year after year, we spend time and money counting an estimated 500,000 kids dropping out of school, joining close to 4 million young people between the ages of 16 and 24 who lack basic literacy skills, many with emotional problems and learning disabilities, many themselves every day becoming parents and starting the cycle anew. We know precisely how many young people penetrate both the child welfare and court systems. We have a name for them too. We call them crossover youth. So we're labeling everything. But what on earth are we doing about it? Is it any surprise that children experiencing persistent maltreatment from infancy to adulthood, or maltreatment during adolescence, are themselves at heightened risk of juvenile delinquency and criminality? Does that surprise anybody? We know that the average annual cost to incarcerate a person is about 3 times what we spend educating a child. We know that close to 1/3 of all kids suspended from school a few times before the spring of their second year of high school simply drop out of school. We know that a majority of state prisoners throughout the nation are high school dropouts. We know that about half of all inmates have children. We know that many of them are even the sole custodial parent. That's a lot of broken families and devastated children. Does this surprise any of you? So plainly, common sense tells us that the time has come to rethink our approach. It's what we see and feel all around us. But these days, it's just not good enough simply to be rational, is it? In order to move policy makers, to move funders, to move action, everything today has to be evidence-based, scientifically established. And boy, do we have data to support new policies. We have court statistics, we have school statistics, we have prison statistics, and we have a lot of other statistics, as you saw this morning. But there's so much more today, so much more. And that's what I refer to, the morning panel, the growing brain science concerning child development. I even saw PowerPoints on fetal development, so even going before birth, which we've been learning about all morning. And really what we have been learning about what we've been seeing and hearing about is the why behind the statistics, the reason behind the statistics. And again, every single day, the new research surrounds us with increasing frequency and visibility. Even the recent Second Circuit Judicial Conference. Now, that's a conference that brings together the entire federal judiciary in this part of the nation. It was dedicated to the subject of the legal brainscape, neuroscience, and the law. Judges want to learn, they want to follow, they want to apply the new science. It affects everything that they do. With respect to adolescents in particular, there is, for example, fascinating new research about maturity and criminal culpability, centered on their impulsivity, their decision-making, and other behaviors linked to brain development. It teaches us that children remain immature and therefore are presumptively less culpable well into late adolescence, and at least twice in recent years, once with respect to the juvenile death penalty, and a second time with respect to a juvenile sentencing, a sentence of life without the possibility of parole. The Supreme Court of the United States actually applied and relied on the brain science research in concluding that both of those sentences were unconstitutional. That is a very strong signal that it sends to courts all through the nation. You should be using it too. Yeah, you better believe it. We've got the evidence. We've got the cold, hard statistics, and we have the scientific research. But today, in addition to the statistics and the research, we have even more. We have the vision that enables us to put all of this to good use. To return to Associate Attorney General Pirelli's words, we have the vision of justice that starts with preventing crime before it happens, protecting our children, and ending cycles of victimization and violence. And I underscore his words, every young person deserves the opportunity to grow up and develop free from fear of violence. In this moment of opportunity, this unique moment of opportunity that is seizing the headlines, seizing public attention, how do we master the statistics and the science and begin to soundly implement the vision? How do we help secure for children the future of our nation and our world, lives that are free of violence and victimization so they can develop their full potential and, by the way, promote a society that's good for all of us, free of crime? Now, difficult as it was for me to find a starting point for my remarks, it's even harder to find a conclusion, particularly if the word conclusion in any way suggests that I am about to answer any of my own questions. But I think there is one absolute fundamental element in my solution, and it is this, that the single best, most promising fact is that we have all come together, the scientists, the law and justice people, we have all come together from different disciplines with different experiences, different perspectives, to collaborate on pathways to achieve our vision, our common vision of social justice for children. Having data, having research is great, but learning how to understand and apply it constructively and productively is quite another thing, and that is something we absolutely have to do together. We have to do it cohesively, we have to do it collaboratively, and we have to do it comprehensively. When pressed for a title, Dr. Lenzer, for my remarks, as you did a few months ago, I picked learning from the past and looking to the future because I thought that was really something we all strive to do, right? And I could talk about anything I wanted to. But and I have to tell you, I hope that is what I do and what I am doing and what we all should do. But I'm especially pleased to be paired on the court section of your program with my friend, Judge Patricia Martin. She's going to have a lot of the answers. Judge Martin is not only the phenomenal, I'm sorry to preempt, the phenomenal presiding judge of the Child Protection Division of the Circuit Court of the amazing Cook County, but she's also the phenomenal president of a great great organization, my heroes, the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges. It is really an amazing group of forward-looking and caring and dedicated human beings, and now has incredible leadership, Judge Martin. And I noticed personal heroes of mine from the world of law in the audience, Elbow, but I'm not going to go on doing this, and sprinkled all through your program. I'm not going to mention any of them for fear of leaving someone out. Dr. Lenzer, you have indeed given us all a magnificent foundation to build toward what I believe is a common vision that we all have. So I'm just going to offer a final comment on the general subject of courts and the judiciary as we together pursue a child protection, child prevention, crime prevention agenda, and rethink such traditional subjects as the role of school expulsion, zero tolerance, and incarceration and detention. In all, an approach to children that is much more collaborative and rehabilitative and much less adversarial. It's clear now beyond doubt, beyond all doubt, that being tough on kids, it's just not a favor to anybody, any of us, not them and not any of us. So now, going with my title, Looking to the Past, during my precious chief judge years, and you've heard I was the chief judge of the state of New York for 15 years, and by the way, children were and will always remain central to my life, my personal life and my professional life. I was, during my years as chief judge, delighted to see a concept we called problem solving, restorative justice, emerge, and over the years actually gain good acceptability across the court system. What courts ask now more frequently is, are we just doing a case disposition? Dispositions are important. Or can we make our intervention, the court intervention, meaningful and constructive? That's what problem-solving justice means. And I saw all sorts of initiatives, wonderful collaborations like drug treatment courts and mental health courts. I saw them flourish throughout New York, throughout the nation, throughout the world, bringing together service providers, school representatives, child advocates, community stakeholders, all working together with a common purpose that begins not with punishment, which we know starts the descent into an abyss, but with an understanding of a child's needs, a family's needs, and efforts to address them. So looking to the future, I trust we can and we will work together, including all the scientists and all the courts and the law world, to turn the prism. We have to keep turning the prism, walking around the statue is what I say. Turn the prism until it catches light. Every young person deserves the opportunity to grow up and develop free from fear of violence. We all can make this happen. We can change the world for children. Thank you so much.
Well, you've already heard what a superstar Judge Patricia Martin is, being the presiding judge of the Child Protection Division of the Circuit Court of Cook County in Illinois. And she's also won numerous awards, too many to mention here today. And she works as president of the Board of Trustees of the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges. She's going to speak today on picking up the pieces, the juvenile court and child abuse.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I think I should just sit down. Judge Kaye, thank you so very much. You are a dear and a hero. I hope one day that I can say I've done part of what you've been able to do in your career. I'd like to also start by thanking the Brooklyn College and Dean Anderson for the invitation to come and speak with you and talk with you today. I've taken a good lesson from my mentor and I have prepared remarks. But I think, like my mentor, I think I'm going to go off script a little bit today and talk a little bit and try to answer a few of the questions that have been posed this morning, but also challenge us with a couple other questions for this afternoon. I think the court is the beneficiary of great teachings from the medical profession, from a lot of other entities and disciplines. One of the things I would suggest to you that the court is having difficulty with and seems to be challenged by is the opportunity and the privilege to be proactive in determining ways in which to take those teachings and translate that into actual practice, effective practice, practice that really does result in helping our young children become productive members of our society. And I use the term our children, because quite honestly, ladies and gentlemen, if we don't embrace the fact that these are really all of our children, we are losing the battle before we begin the fight. And so I would ask you, and I would encourage you and challenge you to think about my children in foster care, all 500,000 across this great nation, as our children. Because quite honestly, when I think about my nieces and nephews and when I talk about their well-being, when I ask them how school's going, I should be able to do that for my kids in foster care in Cook County, if not in New York as well. And people say to me all the time, Judge, you know, these are foster kids, these are not your kids. And I say, well, quite honestly, ladies and gentlemen, if you can't look at them as my children, as your children, we are not even on the same page. Having said that, let me suggest to you that recognizing that foster care and bringing children into foster care is an additional trauma. And you say, Judge, well, duh. That's what my nephew says all the time, duh, Aunt Pat. Well, I will tell you, sitting on the bench for over a decade in Cook County, I don't know if I really thought about that. You know, my thought was that I was doing what's best for children and oftentimes taking and removing children from their families because of the harm, the hurt, the neglect, the abuse in their households were so tremendous. Well, ladies and gentlemen, if you don't know this, let me be the first to tell you, foster care is not a good place for our children. The state is a poor parent for our children, no matter what kind of statistics you are generating in your state. And let me tell you, I am doing well in Cook County, and I am proud to say we are doing well in Cook County. We've reduced our caseload since my tenure as presiding judge from over 40,000 children in foster care to less than 6,500 children today as I stand here before you. And I would suggest you safely reduce them because my rates of reentry have not increased. But ladies and gentlemen, let me still remind you that my children get abused and neglected in foster care. When I have foster parents standing before me saying, well, this isn't my real child, to me, ladies and gentlemen, that means I have a lot more work to do as well as you. Don't get me wrong, I couldn't be a foster parent. I don't know if I have enough love in my heart for that. Think about it. Our systems would fall apart without good foster parents. Foster parents have to not only love my children enough to help give them a foundation so that they can be productive members in our society, but they have to love them just a little bit more to help their families reunite with them when it's possible. I could not be a foster parent, but we need more, but foster care is not good for my kids. I would suggest to you, ladies and gentlemen, that we have to start thinking about psychological first aid for my children and families. I don't know about you, but if someone had told me when I was growing up that either I would have to be separated from Harriet or William Martin, I would fall apart. Now, I didn't think they were the best parents in the world when I was younger. In fact, I wanted to switch them at the mommy market and get better parents. But the fact is, I would not be here today without Harriet and William. And people say all the time, well, Judge Martin, you have to have a very structured life. Well, the reality is, no, I didn't. What I had were parents who had a structured vision for me. What I had were parents who believed in my abilities, even when I didn't believe in my abilities myself. What I had were parents who made it known that I didn't have the choice to go to school. It was a matter of what school I was going to. My only choice was whether I wore blue jeans or red jeans. They made the decisions about what was best for me, and I had to follow through. Someone was asking when the doctor was speaking earlier about spanking, asking me in the back about spanking. Well, I tell the story all the time that my parents had 3 children. I'm the eldest. And my brother is the second one. My brother got a spanking every day he took breath, literally. My mom owned a dry cleaners, and so we had to do our homework at the dry cleaners every day. And my brother would come into the cleaning plant with a cement floor, and he would hang on the wrought iron bars bars and swing from bar to bar. And my mother would graciously start off, sweetheart, don't swing on the bars. Mommy doesn't want you to fall down and break your head open and da-da-da-da. And of course, my brother would continue to swing on the bars. And my mother then, 30 minutes later, would say, boy, didn't I tell you don't swing on the bars? And of course, 45 minutes after that, you got a spanking. And I would have thought that, I actually did think he was mentally retarded. And I know that's not the proper term today, but I say that because I wanted that response. My brother would do this every day, and so I thought he was challenged. Who would, in their right mind, continue to do the same thing, knowing the outcome? My brother did it. Today he's an orthopedic surgeon, 4 children, and doing very well, but I would still suggest to you he didn't get enough spankings. The reality of it is, ladies and gentlemen, I believe fully in what the doctor said this morning, that children don't need to be spanked. I do believe that there's a difference between spanking and corporal punishment. But this is another example of the court learning from the physical and science, physical disciplines in the science field and medical doctors and psychologists. I think that the court is behind the 8 ball in a lot of respects. We have a lot of information that's out there, and we really do struggle with how to really take that information and formulate programs, courts, answers, and ways in which to address some of the problems that we certainly see with our children and families. My legal standard, obviously, is what's in the best interest of my children. Historically, we have focused on risk factors. And I would suggest to you that some of the literature, some of the research out today is encouraging us to also look at the protective factors. It's imperative that we understand not only the strengths, not only the risks that a family poses, but the strengths that the families have in which to help themselves keep their children together. People often ask me, Judge, isn't it easier to remove a child? Well, yes, it is easier to remove a child, but the problem is it better for the child? I would suggest to you today, if I were the king of the world or the queen of the world, I would like to change the law around our nation. I would require at temporary custody, shelter care, whatever your first hearing is, that your agency or your witnesses would have to prove to the court that removing the child would be better than leaving the child at home. Quite honestly, ladies, most of my cases, 65 to 80% of my cases, have an underlying problem of substance abuse, whether it's alcohol or drugs. I can't cure a 12-year drug problem in 9 months. That's the reality of it. What I have to do is make certain that my parents and respondents have the ability to better parent their now, don't get me wrong, they don't have to be Ozzie and Harriet, but they have to better parent their children while they're dealing with the hills and valleys of life that all of us deal with. Not many of our homes, I would suggest with the utmost respect to each and every one of you here today, are much better than some of the homes my families deal with themselves. Some of my families have great support systems. Are they using them effectively? Maybe not. Maybe not. But I would ask you to consider, I'm not going to ask anyone to raise their hands, but how many of you have family members as you sit here today who are having difficulty with the law, in jail, on probation, on supervision, on conditional discharge? How many of us sitting in this audience today have close family members dealing with AIDS, dealing with chronic illnesses, dealing with serious illnesses in their lives? How many of us have people in our immediate family dealing with substance abuse issues, dealing with poverty issues, dealing with lack of jobs, lack of housing? I would suggest more than maybe what we're willing to admit. Those are the same problems that my families are dealing with. Now, it's taken me a long time. I'm unlike Judge Kaye. She learns very quickly. I've been the presiding judge for over a decade, and I am starting to finally understand that it's better to treat my kids in their family unit. Kids do not grow up in a vacuum. It is better to figure out ways to treat my children in their family unit. Why is that, Judge Martin? Well, Chapin Hall has done a study right out of Chicago that looks at longitudinal aspects of the children leaving foster care. They looked at Illinois, Iowa, and Wisconsin, I believe it was. They determined after 5 years the kids leaving foster care have very poor results. They are homeless. They are jobless. The worst thing I have to deal with is on a Monday morning when I go to my chambers and I answer the phone, and it's the homeless shelter calling me, yelling at me, and rightfully so, about having 2 or 3 kids that have just left foster care in their shelter over the weekend. They should be yelling at me. They should be yelling at me. I should not have kids in foster care. I am basically a representative of the state. If the state has an obligation, we have laws that require me to get my kids educated. Kids leaving foster care without an adequate education. Kids leaving foster care without a place to lay their head. Kids leaving foster care without really a future. So, what I'd like to do is spend the next few minutes talking about some of the ways that courts around this nation are starting to address some of these issues. Judge Kaye mentioned that I am the president of the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges. It's an organization out of Reno. The reason I mention that organization, I do want to leave each and every one of you with the impression that judges are concerned about these issues. Judges are working feverishly to try to start addressing some of these issues. Through the National Council, we have one program called Model Court Project. And what it is jurisdictions around this nation, New York is one of them, that look, we look at problems that our kids and families are facing, and what we do is we try to develop innovative programs based on the research you give us on how to effectuate change, positive change for our children and families. And so Chicago is one of those courts as well. And what we do is take, for instance, the issue about silos. Most of our courts are developed and function in silos. So if in fact you have a mental health issue, you go to mental health court. If in fact you have a juvenile justice issue, a child accused of committing a robbery, you go to juvenile justice court. If you have an abuse and neglect issue, you come to my court, child protection. The issue is, or the problem is, if you will, that families don't isolate their problems. Families don't have one problem. Families have a multitude of issues that compile themselves or aggravate themselves into things that result in child abuse and the like. So what the National Council is now in the process of doing is developing a program called Project One. Each of these model courts will look at their court system. So in Cook County, each of my courts are separate to the point that they're at different locations throughout my city. The juvenile court's on the near west side of the city, while my domestic relations court is smack dab in the loop. Figure out ways in which we can coordinate our services so we don't duplicate services, we don't have contradictory services, we have services that are actually working towards a common goal for a family. Seems like it's a pretty easy thing to do. Seems like we should have thought about it years ago. All right, we're getting it together a little bit better now. Talk about ways in which we can have youth. I don't know about your jurisdiction, but my jurisdiction, although I have fewer children in foster care, my population of youth are older. We've raised children in foster care. We're having difficulties helping our older youth really assimilate into the general population. So now what we have are what we call benchmark hearings that are designed specifically for older youth. Our CASAs are trained for older youth. Our social workers work with just one youth, and they are intimately familiar with community-based services for adolescents. We have 2-hour hearings at intervals for these youth. The youth sit down with the worker prior to coming into the court hearing with an understanding of what vocational or educational goals they have in mind, and we as adults figure out ways in which to support that youth. One of my goals, and don't tell anyone down in Springfield, but I changed the permanency goals in the state of Illinois, and now every youth leaving care has to have a caring adult. Whether or not that caring adult is appropriate placement or not is kind of irrelevant. I'm on old age pension on the other side. My parents died more than 25 years ago. One thing that happened in my family was my parents gave us, alarm clocks. I went to school here in Vermont, so they couldn't wake me up every day. But they had alarm clocks and everything. But when we went home, the way we woke up was my mom singing Precious Lord throughout our house. Now you would say, oh wow, it must have sounded like Aretha Franklin, right? No, my mother couldn't sing a lick. But the issue was when we were home, that's how we woke up. Well, the day my mom died, I couldn't figure out. Now remember, my dad had been bedridden for 10 years prior to his death. He died the year after my mom passed. So my dad was bedridden. I was the oldest, the only one out of school. My brother was in medical school, my sister was an undergrad, and I couldn't figure out how we were going to wake up the next morning. What saved me literally was that my Aunt Catherine, we call her Aunt Kitty, K-I-T-T-Y, woke me up at 6 o'clock by calling and said, "Good morning, sweetheart, how's your day, how are you doing?" My Aunt Catherine called me at 6 o'clock Central Time, and I emphasize Central Time, from that day until the day she died a year ago. Now, if I was in Australia, Kitty called me 6 o'clock Central Time, and she asked the same questions. How are you doing, sweetheart? What are you doing? Same thing. The point of the matter is, my rock was Aunt Kitty, and I figure each child in foster care needs an Aunt Kitty, not only out of Cook County, but all across this nation. Ladies and gentlemen, these are lessons we're learning from you. It takes us a while to learn them, I know. It takes us a while to figure out what we can do about them. But you have to keep providing us with the information so that we can take that and translate it into ways that really do make a difference and better improve the outcomes for our children and families. I am delighted to share this opportunity with you this afternoon. Certainly, if you have any questions about the specific programs I mentioned, I'm more than happy to try to direct those directly. Certainly, if you're interested in more information about the National Council, and I will tell you up front, we are inviting doctors. I now have Children's Memorial, when the residents go through their PEDS rotation, they have to spend a day at my court now. It's imperative that we start cross-pollinating with this information, and so I invite you to start submitting white papers to the National Council, and I hope you encourage us to submit white papers and a syllabus and abstracts to your conferences so that we can start sharing some of this information. Judge Kaye, thank you so very much for sharing the podium with me today. Thank you, Dean Anderson.
Just terrific presentations, and I know we're running late on time, but I'm going to take the moderator's prerogative to ask a question. Judge Martin, you talked about your ability in Cook County to decrease the number of kids in foster care, and yet not to increase the incidence of later substantiated abuse and neglect. Tell me, how'd you do it?
Well, the secret was we started in the 90s when the economy was better. No. One of the things that we've done is we've put in a 2-tier screening system, which has tremendously helped us in our ability to isolate the kids that actually have to come into care. And what I mean by that, historically, the agency decides when a case is appropriate for filing to come into court. What they do, though, is they look at the facts to determine whether or not they should file a petition with the court. What we did was institute a legal screening as well. So prior to filing, they have to go to the state's attorney's office and determine whether or not there's a legal basis in which to file as well. So then what we do is we weed out those situations that they aren't ready for legal determination. And also the cases that factually can be resolved on a voluntary basis, we keep those out of the system. And then with the cases coming into care, my position with my judges, notice how possessive I am, my judges, is to make certain that if a child does not have to come in care, I'll accept the petition to keep the child at home on order of protection with mom or dad.
Wow.
So we are making a difference in trying to really look at how to keep families together.
I just want to add, Dean Anderson, that you will find an analogous set of statistics in New York and probably throughout the nation. I know in the early 90s, our foster care population in New York City was in the 60,000s, and today it's probably in the 20,000s. So I think that a lot of good, careful work has gone into that. As long as we're on the subject of foster care, and Patricia has raised this, and we've talked so much this morning about prevention, and we've gone back to conception, actually. But what Patricia raised, which is a subject that just fascinates me, and that is children aging out of foster care. Never, the ones going in are a huge problem, but the ones coming out, we can almost name them, right? I mean, they are such a finite problem. Why can we not resolve that problem? Why? We have a limited role of kids who have had extremely stressful, troubled lives. I say we can name them, we can see them. Why can't we do something to help them over the bridge?
I think one of the things that's helping us today is that we are now getting a lot of literature to suggest and to make certain that we understand that even removing a child when it's absolutely positively has to happen, when it's the last resort, still does result in trauma.
Yes.
When we look at kids who have successful foster care experiences, when they have one placement, they get adopted in that one, they still have trauma. And so recognizing those types of things are allowing us to provide that underlying carriage of care that I think we've been missing in the past. And if I could just go back 1 second, if you look at the 3 largest jurisdictions in our nation, New York, Chicago, and LA, all of these courts are model courts of the National Council, and Judge Kaye is absolutely right. All of us have had similar reductions in our caseloads in the last decade and a half. And part of it is making certain that we figure out innovative ways to do what Judge Kaye has been talking about, utilizing the research and the literature that you are bringing to us in a more effective way. The reduction in the number of cases that we took in the year 2009, I believe, saved, if those kids had gone into care in LA, New York, and Chicago alone, just those 3 jurisdictions, our nation would have spent $1.6 billion. So I can't say it's a saving of 1.6, but I can tell you not having those other children in foster care in those 3 jurisdictions reduced our bill, our child welfare bill, by $1.6 billion in just 1 year. So think about what we can do with just those 3 jurisdictions.
And I wanted to mention that Judge Kaye is responsible for a lot of the innovative work here in New York around these areas, obviously.
So thank you for saying that, but as long as we're talking about responsibility, I will shift the responsibility to the quote-unquote scientific community. I don't think it's all, I think the courts over the past, well, you've just seen such a superb judge, and I think you can see exactly the sort of judge she is. And I'm sure she has reached out endlessly to make the things that happen in Cook County happen. It was my experience, and I will lay this challenge to all of you, that I don't think there is enough coming from the other side. I remember the day
What do you mean coming from
well,
which
I
side?
remember the day, for example, in the family court when we brought doctors over. We went for a conference on shaken baby syndrome. They didn't know where the family court was. We did it in Queens. We did it in the Bronx. I remember days in the court system that we didn't have social workers. You know, now today our judges happily introduce quote unquote their social worker. Well, I think we need a little bit more of a push from the other side too, because clearly the collaboration is what makes a big difference. I thought by casting blame I would get some action.
I think Judge Kaye is completely correct. We could not do our work in a vacuum without the work of all of those other entities and all the other disciplines, without the collaboration and really collaboration, rolling up our sleeves and giving up some of the power at the table. I mean, it's very easy for a judge to call a meeting, and everyone typically comes because they're afraid you're going to lock them up or something, but really rolling up our sleeves and giving them the opportunity, the other entities, the other disciplines, the opportunity to come in and really help us solve the problems has provided an opportunity for us to really work together. I would like to just take 2 seconds, if I might, and just indicate that the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges has endorsed and is signing on to the joint statement that's included in your pamphlet today. And I personally would strongly encourage you to really read through that and see whether or not you would be willing to sign on it and join with us in this effort to really reduce the number of our children in foster care, but more importantly, help the children who are in foster care become more productive members of our society.
One of the problems with having a panel with lawyers is that we talk a lot. And we can talk a lot more here because this issue is so fascinating. But I want to give an opportunity for maybe 2 comments from the audience, and then we'll move on to lunch because we're a little behind. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you both for the presentation. I had 30 years of work in child welfare. I'm very concerned about, and I also am an adjunct lecturer in children's studies. But one of the things I'm very concerned about is the dearth of resources in the community for the community care. And for families whose children are not able to really, I am a proponent of maintaining them in the community where children can be safe. But there's not enough in the community. So I think the challenge is not only the social sciences, but government and philanthropy to support initiatives in the community.
If I might just quickly respond, I would definitely agree with you. There is a movement, if you will. A lot of people don't like me to call it a movement, but there is a lot of work being done on the issue of disproportionality of minorities in foster care as well as disparate treatment. And what I mean by disparate treatment is in Chicago, for instance, on the south side of the city, some of the services, community-based services, are different than the services offered on the north side, not only in quantity, but also in quality. And so we really have to struggle to make certain that people understand what we need. And there is a real effort in Cook County to make certain that the services are more effective and appropriate for our families. To the extent that we've experimented with like Black parenting classes and a whole series of other different kinds of programs to really start addressing the cultural differences of our families. But also making certain that they're widely available when necessary. So I do agree with you, and it is something that the court can be a proactive advocate for, but it requires all of us to work together.
So maybe one more comment or question? Yes, sir.
Yes, Judge Martin, you mentioned that when youngsters leave foster care, that you have managed to partner them up with a caring adult. Could you talk about how you did that?
Well, first of all, judges can't lobby, of course. So we encourage some of our partners to go down to Springfield and talk with some of our legislators about the possibility of having a sunshine law that allows us to reinstate parental rights. So the question is, or the issue is, that 3 years old, the risk factors for a child were vastly different than the risk factors of that same child at 21 with a mom, for instance, using the same amount of drugs. And so if we separated them, legally separated them at 3, they don't really physically separate. My kids go back to their parents all the time. And so rather than just throwing him out of foster care with no basis, no underlying basis or supports or rocks, my Aunt Kitty rocks, what we do is we reinstitute that relationship so that the department is legally responsible for trying to strengthen that relationship. I'm not so idealistic that I think I'm going to cure mom's drug problem when he's 18. If I can, that's great, that's wonderful. If I can't, though, I can teach him how to navigate when mom's using what he needs to do, when mom's not using what he can do, how he can work with mom when he needs to, but also find other supports to help him along the road to becoming that productive member. So we've been starting to reinstitute parental rights with the understanding while they're still in care, the department has a legal responsibility with our 4 replacement dollars to continue providing services. But making certain, and I tell people all the time, I don't care if the stable person is a drunken uncle. It doesn't really matter to me. I'm not looking for a safe and appropriate placement. I'm looking for stability of relationship. Adults, if they call my kid on Christmas morning or Hanukkah or you know, whatever, Kwanzaa and say happy birthday, I'm cool with that. So long as my child feels some need for that adult and that adult feels some need for my child, that's what I'm talking about.
And let me add a word also, if I might, on that subject, because this is one of the great frustrations of my afterlife. I'm in a law firm, I must be one of the top law firms in the United States, where people can leave after very wonderful careers at age 55. That's called retirement today. And I don't think we're that unique. You know, by the time 55, 60, 65, I'm seeing an enormous alternative energy resource that our nation is throwing out the window. There are so many people who would call a person to say Merry Christmas, Happy Kwanzaa, whatever. Why can't we figure out a way to take this alternative energy resource, not just retired Skadden Arps partners, but people who have had wonderful careers and are blessed with good health and good heart and would like to be helped, but why can't we find systemic ways to connect them with this generation of children who are in need of something other than incarceration and desperation? Why can't we put them together? I am searching for the way myself, and I turn the challenge to you.
Do you have any legislation along the lines of this?
I apologize, could you repeat that?
Do you have any legislation along the lines that you submitted?
The reinstatement of parental rights? Yes, sir. Sure.
This has been just a terrific panel. I think we're really now talking about some of the cutting edge stuff at the tail end of childhood. We started with sort of what happens prenatally, and now we're talking about aging out of foster care and some of the consequences of all of the work that we've understood at the beginning of life and throughout childhood. So this is really cutting edge stuff in the law and in society, and I really appreciate the thoughtful and very insightful remarks of both panelists. Thank you.